John Paul Ricco has also crossed international borders and endured heroic travel to be with us here today. He is a professor of comparative literature, art history, and visual culture at the University of Toronto. Known internationally as an expert on the work of the continental philosopher Jean-Luc Nancy, he teaches and writes on queer theory, as well as on contemporary art, architecture, philosophy, and film. In two published books, The Logic of the Lure from 2002 and The Decision Between Us from 2014, as well as in his current and ongoing work, Professor Ricco is preoccupied by the ontological preconditions for phenomena such as intimacy, community, and the being with another that we call sex. The measure of his intellectual seriousness is that he takes none of these things for granted, but rather questions them at their foundations. He has made original contributions on these themes by showing from fresh methodological perspectives how sexuality, sociability, and community all may be approached as distinctly aesthetic issues. Thus, although he holds a PhD in art history from the University of Chicago, I would not describe John Ricco as an art historian. Instead, he is, and I mean that I think as a compliment, without any slam on the art historians who are here. It's a delicate line I am tracing. Instead, he is a queer philosopher of aesthetics whose scholarship has enlarged the boundaries of, and hence our understanding of, the aesthetic field. I'm very keen to learn how he approaches Hal Fischer's work through Michel Foucault's seminars on sexuality. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor John Ricco.
Thank you, Tim, for that lovely introduction. Thank you all for being here. It's really a pleasure. What do I need to do? Okay. From an art historical perspective, Hal Fischer's photographs from the 1970s are an important part of the history of conceptual art photography. In his use of seriality, black and white images, and the evenly spaced hanging of the framed photographs in linear rows or grids, Fischer's work is historically situated along a spectrum of precedents and amongst several contemporaries. These include Berndt and Hilla Becher's typologies of technical constructions, these from the early 1960s right up to the early 21st century, a career-long project of producing photographs of primarily industrial architecture that minimalist artist Carl Andre referred to as anonymous sculptures. Martha Rossler's double refusal of linguistic and visual representation in her famous The Bowery in Two Inadequate Descriptive Systems of 1974-75, and the vernacular photographs of Douglas Hubler's variable piece, 1971-97. Hubler's critique of the genre of high art portrait photography is clearly evident in Fischer's work, as it is in Richard Prince's Three Men Looking in the Same Direction of 1978, and his appropriation of advertising imagery representing an idealized masculinity, and in the more queer idealization of Andy Warhol's 13 Most Wanted Men of 1964, and also in the parodic performance of Robert Morris's self-portrait as gay leather clone, which blurs the distinction between art and advertisement and was created expressly for the pages of Artforum magazine as promotion for his exhibition at Castelli Sonnabend Gallery in 1974. Finally, in the use of photographic images, or what Douglas Crimp famously referred to as pictures, as the means of deconstructing concepts of identity, we can point to Adrian Piper's The Mythic Being and her performative inhabiting of the stereotypical black macho, also 1974, as well as Cindy Sherman's classic Untitled Film Stills, 1979. That's a blank slide. It can be argued that the work of each of these artists played no small part in the inauguration of a critical, post-structural transformation of anthropological discourse in the 1970s. By applying an aesthetic conceptual pressure to the practice of social categorization via identity, by foregrounding an anti-naturalist conception of human being, and by highlighting the discursive production of individual subjects via representation, each of us may be nothing more than a picture, a simulacrum. Rossler, Hubler, Prince, Warhol, Morris, Piper, Sherman, and Fischer all sought to present the subjective self as a fabricated fiction, an imaginary construct. This was the subject of the photographic activity of postmodernism, the widely read article by Douglas Crimp that appeared in the journal October in winter 1980. There, Crimp puts forth the notion of the image and subject as having presence, meaning not simply being there, nor as being ghostly, but in the precise sense of a supplementarity or bearing an aura, in other words, being more than there. What the subject image emits is presence that is opposite any metaphysical sense of presence. Working out from Walter Benjamin's work of art essay, Crimp famously argued that the photographic activity of postmodernism consists in the aura of the copy, the reproduction, the archetype, and the stereotype, to which we add the clone. It is in this way that the image, or in Crimp's idiom, the picture in itself, but also as the very pictorial ground of any subjectivity, is redefined as that which is always already seen. Meaning that the image is a priori, but also that the a priori is an image. As far as I know, Crimp never discussed Hal Fischer's work, and this represents an unfortunate gap, especially considering the trajectory that Crimp's work will take soon after the postmodernism essay appears toward the aesthetics and politics of gay male culture, specifically in the AIDS crisis. I would like to imagine that if Crimp had attended to Fischer's work back then in the late 1970s, his notion of presence might have included the notion of sex appeal, or even further and more precisely, yet once again following Benjamin, the sex appeal of the inorganic. That's Benjamin's phrase. Meaning a formulation of sex and sexuality that in significant ways operates beyond, or at least in addition, to the human organic subject, and therefore distinct from any anthropology of sexuality. Of course, what I am referring to is the extraneous clothing, props, gear, and accessories that come to function in the work as what Fischer himself has referred to as a lexicon of attraction. a gay semiosis or series of sign stimuli in and through which scenes of erotic, discursive, lyrical encounter might take place. Yet if we take desire to be inextricably related to negativity, about which any positive image or representation can provide access, then we might say that Fischer's sign stimuli underlie the extent to which desire can never be satisfied or fulfilled, including by representations or pictures. And yet at the same time, his images affirm that seeing this negativity, or what I am more inclined to term inoperativity, is its own form of desire and perhaps pleasure. For while most of Fischer's contemporaries in the field of conceptual photography were also delineating the limits of visual representation, few of them were conceiving of these limits in terms of desire and sex. By bringing desire and sex to bear on the limits of visual representation, Hal Fischer not only made a unique and extremely significant contribution to conceptual photography, he also took this artistic attention to discursive systems, or what Benjamin Buchloh referred to as an aesthetics of administration, and made it evident that discourse, modern and postmodern, finds principal referent in sexuality, and that sexuality is the correlate of discourse. In doing so, Fischer's work poses two questions. A, what did sexuality have to be? What did it have to become for it to become the referential of discourse? And two, what did literary, philosophical, scientific, and artistic discourses have to become for each of them to be able to take sexuality as a referential? These two questions, of course, also happen to be the ones that define Michel Foucault's thinking on sexuality. Posing them by bringing them together, that is, sexuality discourse and artistic discourse sexuality, marks the singular achievement of Fischer's work, not just in the gay 70s, but in the 1970s and beyond more broadly. I'm grateful for the opportunity to explore Hal Fischer's work afforded by the exhibition and Tim Dean's invitation to the symposium. Over the past few weeks, and now months actually, I've been thinking about Fischer's work while reading the newly published lectures on sexuality that Foucault gave in 1964 at the University of Clermont-Ferrand and in 1969 at the Experimental Center of Vincennes. For me, the opportunity to reappraise the centrality of the question of the discourse of sexuality in Foucault's work parallels the opportunity to reappraise the place of Fischer's work in those very same discourses. My working premise is that this exhibition and the symposium and the newly published Foucault lectures mutually illuminate each other and provide an occasion to newly appreciate the radical interventions made by these two projects, then and now, in the 1960s and 70s, and via their current presentation and publication today. And perhaps to measure the extent to which their critical interventions have yet to be adequately absorbed. In those lectures, Foucault diagrams two essential paths that must be taken together to understand the place of sexuality in modern discourse and society. One, an anti-anthropological archaeology of sex, and two, an attention to limits and divisions, along with openings toward and inappropriable outside. These will structure and guide the remainder of my paper, in which Fischer's sign stimuli provoke, attract, and instantiate desires and tastes that, in portending the limits of knowledge, are consecrated to perversion and profanation, which is to say, to the ontology of sexuality as without consolation or consummation. It is in this way that the works can also provide a lesson or even a corrective to some of the more prominent and seemingly untiring inclinations of queer theory today. One of the primary targets of Foucault's critique was the anthropology of sexuality, which coalesced and found a venue in a special issue of the journal Esprit in 1960. Leading the charge was the philosopher Paul Ricco, who, as the editors of the Foucault sexuality lectures describe, quote, strives to promote a human conception of sexuality founded on an intersubjective ethics, the interpersonal relationship and affection. In opposition to what Ricco himself referred to as the loss of meaning and the fall into insignificance of contemporary eroticism. God forbid. I think it is not a stretch and far from an unfair comparison to see in some of the major strands of contemporary queer theory the same commitment to such things as human meaning articulated through subjects and subjectivity, a dialectic in ethics of intersubjectivity and relational intimacy, love, and the methodological desire for knowledge of an adequate relation between subject and object, which is always basically an ideality. Too much of contemporary queer theory remains committed to sexuality as a project of development for the individual subject and its relations with others through love, history, and kinship. This continues to play itself out in historicist and or utopian narratives of continuity and becoming. It is in these ways that the hegemonic and most cited forms of queer theory are shockingly and perhaps unwittingly part of a humanist neoliberal project. It is also a form of theory predicated upon the presumption, characteristic of a Marxist Debordian strand of leftism, the presumption that by coming to a greater awareness and knowledge of its situation in the world, the queer subject will be able to free itself from alienation or exclusion. In a word, from finitude. Opposite this is what we find in the work of Jean Genet, Roland Barthes, Leo Bersani, Tim Dean, William Haver, Ray Tirada, and Jacques Philippe. Namely, a queer ethos of leaving, betrayal, and departure, or inertia, and an aesthetics of separation, obscurity, looking away, and last things. Birding and species identification, sexual display and cruising, maritime codes, and wireless transmission. What the items of this list have in common is that they all operate through sign stimuli. Indeed, for sexual behavior, his third lecture in the 1964 course, Foucault extensively draws upon Louis Bonnoir's book on sexual instinct, the study of animal psychology of 1956, who in turn quotes from Edward Allworthy Armstrong's slightly earlier study titled Bird Display and Behavior, an Introduction to the Study of Bird Psychology of 1947. So one of the revelations, many revelations that come out of the publication of these early lectures on sexuality by Foucault is that he was completely immersed in the study of animal behavior, animal sexuality, as part of this study of sign stimuli. It was a key part of his early development of his thinking on the discourse of sexuality. While cross-species analysis of sexuality and sexual behavior remains an interesting and fruitful field of inquiry, the lesson that I want to draw from this material is the one taken up by Foucault himself, namely that sign stimuli are environmental stimulations. They involve an attraction not to an object per se, but to a precise situation, following specific sensory elements or decoys, with patterns developing out of the relationship between stimuli and the situation. It is in this way that semiotics can be conceived as the study of stimulations. Sign stimuli enable us to go so far as to suggest that the ontology of the sign is that which is born out of sexuality, such that the phrase sexual semiotics would be something of a pleonasm. This is a pleasure of the sign that we are familiar with in our reading of Roland Barthes, for instance, but also of Fischer's gay semiotics. Clandestine, impersonal, and promiscuous, the sign stimuli that Fischer photographically records and annotates are modes of communication illegible to most others outside of the sexual communities in which they operate. And this I take to be largely what Tim was getting at in his question to Joao about this degree of unreadability. They thereby are elements of various social sexual demi-monde of the sort studied by Daniel Tiffany in his brilliant book, Infidel Poetics. Undergrounds, right, sexual undergrounds, social undergrounds, structured, or more accurately, destructured, through forms of lyric obscurity and solipsism. What this leads to, I want to argue, following now Sam C., is the pleasure of the sign as the pleasure of ignorance. C goes on to describe this queer comportment, he is speaking specifically of love, as, quote, the pleasure of renouncing our desire to fill the whole of knowledge, H-O-L-E, right, the empty hole of knowledge, to make knowledge whole, W-H-O-L-E, to master those whom we bear relation. By articulating things in this way, in his homage to Leo Bersani, C is foregrounding a premise that was central to Foucault's ethics, and which Bersani has developed more so, I would say, than anyone else in his own thinking toward non-mastery opposite the sovereign authority of the epistemological subject, the one who knows. Yet even further, I want to read in Bersani's definition of desire as, quote, the exciting pain of a certain ignorance, right? Desire, the exciting pain of a certain ignorance, and as, quote, the failure to penetrate the sense of the other's soliciting, end of quote. It's not only a highlighting of the epistemological limits that are inherent in intimacy, but also is pointing to the discontinuities that pervade our being with others in the world, predicated upon the essential and irreducible fact of existential finitude, that force that rips an unmendable tear in the fabric of anthropological thought. It was Foucault who cast the epistemological project as modernity's compensatory response to this fact of finitude, with the will to know being the drive that seeks to confront and overcome this force of finitude. As he stated in the 1969 lectures, quote, the function of anthropological thought is to preserve man from these discontinuities. I'll add, in other words, death, desire, separation, exclusion, and other forms of finitude. And Foucault, to put his death, others, and history within his reach, man's reach. For Foucault, sexuality is the principal means of division out of which the social and modern subject is created and cast into this realm of discontinuities. As he put it in his 1963 essay on Bataille, titled Preface to transgression, the inspiration for the title of my paper, sexuality, quote, has become the only division possible in a world now emptied of objects, beings, and spaces to desecrate, I would say to profane, right? It permits, and then he says, a profanation without object, which is a wonderful phrase, formulation. In the remainder of my talk, I will argue that profanation as a queer aesthetic ethical comportment is the sustaining of these discontinuities and inappropriable spaces of separation, and the pleasurable rapport with finitude. In doing so, I will draw upon the distinction that Foucault makes between two kinds of knowledge: knowledge connaissance and knowledge savoir, aligning the former with the anthropology of sexuality that remains prevalent in current queer theory, and knowledge savoir as a queer ethos that, without providing consolation or achieving consummation, is the kind of profanation without object that Foucault spoke of in 1963. This is also the idea of profanation that Giorgio Agamben will develop most explicitly in the collection of essays titled Profanations of 2005. But also, as I read it, in his very early book, Gusto, Taste, written in 1979, only published in Italian in 2015 and translated into English in 2018. In that early text, Agamben makes a series of distinctions according to which major fields of study are structured in terms of pleasure and knowledge. For instance, science knows the truth but cannot enjoy it. For political economy, neither the object of pleasure nor knowledge are enjoyed, but rather succumb to judgments and measures as they are subsumed within a system of value and interest. In turn, whereas in aesthetics, the object of pleasure is not known, given that it exists in excess of meaning, signification, and interpretation, psychoanalysis is construed as the combination of aesthetics and political economy, now rendered as libidinal economy, where knowledge is not known, but revealed in symbols and signifiers. Philosophy, of course, is the love of knowledge and the knowledge of love, Plato's eros, in which one knows the object of pleasure, knowledge that is known, and enjoys the object of pleasure, pleasure that is enjoyed. However, this is neither knowledge of or for the other, nor of or for the subject, but is a knowledge that exists in the fracture or separated spacing between. Finally, we arrive at taste, in which the knowledge known and the pleasure enjoyed of philosophy are now crossed, as though in a chiasmus, such that we can speak of taste as a knowledge of pleasure and a pleasure of knowledge. In other words, it is in the exercise of taste that we arrive at a knowledge that enjoys and a pleasure that knows. Yet this is not the knowledge connaissance of science, political economy, or perhaps even a certain acritical structural form of psychoanalysis, what Tim Dean has described following Bataille as a restricted economy within a certain contemporary Lacanian psychoanalytic discourse in your essay on the countenance of the perversions. Instead, this is knowledge savoir, that in its sense of that which is either empty, excessive, or opaque, is a form of knowledge that is not known but only enjoyed by a subject operating less according to the imperative know thyself than as the care and use of the self, bodies, others, and things. Taste is that sight that illuminates the fractures of Western metaphysics, specifically between truth and beauty, and knowledge and pleasure. Or to put it more simply, everything lies in the split and how we deal with the split between the intelligible and the sensible. And some of this came up in Terry's talk, and that sort of moved between, I forget what the terms were. It was the physical and the metaphysical, having and being, right? This kind of, so I think that's the maps on this in the same way. Yet there is a specific form of knowledge savoir, knowledge pleasure, in taste, which not only exceeds the juridical duality of good and bad taste of aesthetic judgment, but more radically operates by not knowing the limits of the object of knowledge, in other words, of the object of pleasure, and enjoying or finding pleasure in this non-knowledge. This is queer perversion. Pleasure and non-knowledge without a transcendent concept or ideality, but instead is that which is consecrated to the here, now, this of sensuous, erotic empiricism, one mode of which is fetishism, specifically in its inoperative use of the thing, using as not using. It is in this regard that we can argue that perversion is not the opposite of taste, but its highest form and apotheosis. The fetish is one type of excessive or floating signifier, to reference Levi-Strauss, who we know Hal was reading, that marks a fundamental and essentially insurmountable distance between signification and knowledge. Is this not what Hal Fischer's photographs are foregrounding, as they parodically present the desire to speak to and arrive at an adequate or an adequation between a thing, such as a colored paisley handkerchief or a gag mask, and what it means? William Haver, in his masterpiece of an article, Really Bad Infinities, Queer's Honor and the Pornographic Life, theorizes the fetish as the thing in its singularity, the thing itself, non-metaphorical, non-signifying, non-substitutable, and unsurpassable in its thisness. Unlike the ordinary commodity object, there is nothing fungible about the fetish, because as Haver explains, the fetish is, in its impersonality and promiscuity, nothing other than an incommensurable finite singularity. Irreducible to phenomenological, psychological, biographical, or anthropological description or interpretation, the fetish is the untranslatable of empiricism, resistant to any philosophy or concept by which knowledge might be produced. And this is what makes the fetish perverse, profane, and pornographic. The fetishist is the name for an unmotivated comportment and attention to the part outside of any whole, and always in relation to its limits. Anything can be eroticized, any part of the body or quality of an inanimate object, because the body or thing, as Foucault pointed out in his last lecture from 1964, quote, is the body, let me try to read, because the body or thing is never eroticized all at once and simultaneously in its entirety. As Haver goes on to state, one attends to the fetish for the sake of nothing but that attention, which is to say, for the pleasure of the thing. I see the taste of the perverse fetishist to be opposite what Foucault regarded as the, quote, radical malice of knowledge, which he described as involving, quote, a will, not to bring the object near to oneself or identify with it, but on the contrary, to get away from it and destroy it. How are we doing?
Keep going to finish soon.
Keep going, but stop. Gosh, and I thought this was a short paper. Okay, I'm going to jump ahead. I'm going to cut a hole. Where are my slides? Profanation is not opposition, negation, mockery, violence, or the victory over limits, but is the affirmation, the non-positive affirmation of the infinite finitude of existence, the limitless limit, as Foucault described it in 1963. Profane is that community of anonymous, clandestine, solitary nobodies, opposite exemplary and paradigmatic portraits, but also the included exclusion of bare life produced by biopolitical sovereignty. We are here called upon to think in terms of excluded exclusion, exclusion doubled, as in already made scenes of passing, loitering, cruising, and departing that find their visual documentation in Hal Fischer's 18th near Castro times 24. This scene of environmental stimulations is not a consoling integrative utopia, but is a heterotopia punctuated through and through by the incommensurable. Such incommensurable heterotopias are real spaces, yet as other than place in an abstract space. Instead, they exist and function as immanent counterspaces of sociality and sexuality, such that if we were to insist on retaining the language of utopia, we would only be able to do so by qualifying this space as an inoperative utopia, the scene of what I have described and theorized elsewhere as an unbecoming community. Okay, once again, skipping a couple paragraphs, I do want to kind of wrap up. But then you start cutting and then it doesn't make sense. Okay. While toward the end of her truly brilliant book, Looking Away, Ray Terada states that, quote, photography itself can't be looking away, only influenced by it, since the photograph lasts indefinitely, to be revisited and imagined, to be shared. I want to suggest whether, in fact, we can conceive of looking away photography. Such a notion finds its inspiration in Agamben's short essay on photography titled Judgment Day, featured in his collection Profanations. There, the indefinite lasting of the photograph of which Terada speaks is cast in terms of the infinite recapitulation of the ordinary gesture of ordinary singularity. In other words, in the Agamben piece, it's shoe shining as captured in Daguerre's photograph of a Paris street scene. For Agamben, this is to be understood as the supreme, ultimate, or we might say last moment, that rhythmic temporal moment of life inseparable from its form, mode, and ethos. It is the passage of the anonymous passerby in their passing, living as leaving, and in this way its own ascetic mode of ecstasis. It is anonymous itinerancy spoken by the voice that, Agamben tells us, Edgar Aubert, Proust's boy lover, inscribed in English this dedication on the back of his photographic portrait. Look at my face. My name is might have been. I am also called no more. Too late. Farewell. What makes Daguerre's image, and I am arguing also the 24-hour scene recorded by Fischer's photo series, an image of the Last Judgment, is the way in which, as Agamben explains, quote, the crowd of humans, indeed all of humanity, is present, but it cannot be seen because the judgment concerns a single person, a single life, precisely this one and no other. Okay, final two paragraphs. Now beyond the floating signifier as either state of exception or the undecidable, here we arrive at the excluded exclusion that I spoke of earlier. Photography is testimony to all the lost names, and this would seem to be no better presented than in Hal Fischer's images. The black bars that cover the eyes and the portraits that make up the Boyfriend series. The initials that are the only record of the first names of those encountered in Castro times 24. The only form that redemption takes here is the re-bestowing of anonymity to the name of each singularity, as evidenced in ordinary everyday gestures such as smoking, cruising, sunbathing, shining shoes, and so on. The gesture, as that which exceeds any semiotics or other attempt to arrive at signification, lies in that breach or gap that we've invoked more than once now, there between the sensible and the intelligible, image and tale, aesthesis and discourse, knowledge savoir and knowledge connaissance. Gesture, that spacing of separation, is given over to the oblivion of forgetting, which Agamben defines as justice. Just one day, just one street corner, just an image or series of images. This is the real state of exception, the real anarchy of the commons, the ungovernable, unmarked, the unspeakable, the as such and the as not, the irreparable and therefore the profane. Thank you.
John, thank you so much. You cut, but you still gave us so much. And as in so many cases, I want somebody to keep going, but also to stop. I want more, but I can't take more.
That was my paper. That's intimacy. Keep going and stop.
So that was we have come back from lunch and we have like really gotten into it. Questions, comments from the audience, observations, interventions. Question coming from Jeannie Brinkemer.
John, I loved that, and I want you to keep talking because I'd love to hear your reading of the last photograph in this series, because that's the one that has the time but blankness, right? It doesn't narrate the encounter, right? It's just that the new introduction of the people and then the guy who's been there all night. Because I kind of want to ask you about skepticism and about the difference between, let's say, blankness, which I would take as a kind of register of skepticism, right? A skepticism so extreme one cannot produce anything, and these sort of contingent particular narrations that for you seem to be part of that gesture to a kind of infinite opening. So what do we do with the blankness? I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
It's an interesting, and I want to hear Hal's thoughts on that too. I would have shown it. I was limited in terms of the images I could find. Sorry about that. My hunch, and it's just that, it's really no more than that, and it's probably not a very good one actually, is that last image, it indicates 8 a.m., right? That's the only caption, right? You only get the timestamp. And then as you say, it's blank, right? And there's a single figure who may be one of these guys here, and they're speaking to a male and female couple. And the hunch would be that there's something about that scene, that staging, that negates the tale, that negates the story, the caption, that it actually does that, right? Because there's some other kind of, we could say, intersubjective, something going on there that then negates the caption, right? That would follow my argument. But at the same time, the caption in its timestamp blankness also undoes whatever we think might be happening there, transmitting, being communicated between those three individuals, right? That we're really at the limits of discourse. We're at the limits of, it's whether it's the secret or whether it's skepticism or I don't know what. It's that thing that exceeds language, right? That thing that Bersani has always been so fond of saying, which I love, which is these moments when language is curiously inadequate, beside the point, absolutely irrelevant, right? And he's always interested in those moments because language as this incredible epistemological tool, right? This part of that will to know, right? And the thing is, why? Why do we, why that? And I think we ask that question about the limits of language, just as in art history and visual culture, we ask the question of the limits of the image and visuality and so forth, right? Those things that can't be seen, or those things that maybe even exceed the illegible or the invisible. They go the way of finitude. They go the way of oblivion and forgetting, and certainly for Agamben, that's what photography is dedicated to. It's dedicated to that realm. It points to that thing that, which is, he says, Judgment Day, right? It's every day is Judgment Day, because there is no longer that final sovereign moment of judgment, right? There's just gesture. There's just profanation, right? And by the way, the other thing that came to me in the morning as I was listening was how how this business about the left and the right, right? Within the concerns about judgment have everything to do with the theological, particularly Christian way of dividing the Last Judgment into the saved and the damned, right? Alla destra and alla sinistra, right? The left and the right. And what you have here, I think, is a profanation of that, a perversion of that, right? Of that left-right as the division that structures theological judgment, right? Where now you get the sexual subject as this non-sovereign, non-authoritative, non-judgmental subject that, decides between left and right for reasons that obviously have nothing to do with any kind of moral, theological code, law, or dog, right? I mean, there's where it's just a nice way of thinking about profanation yet again, as another way of thinking about a perversion of those theological divisions of judgment, that use that dichotomy of left and right.
Question from Terry Weissman.
I agree with Jeannie. I totally loved your talk, and a lot of it resonated with me, just with like a slightly different angle, kind of, but well, not slightly, but a big different angle. But I related to a lot of it, and it was a very open-ended question. But I was especially excited when you showed the Hubler, because that is something that I had wanted to show, but just it didn't make it in there. But instead of being skepticism to the point of blankness, it's the opposite, the Hubler, because it's trying to show every person in the world or whatever, but then it ends up with, I don't know if blankness, but sort of something like that. So I'm just really curious for you to talk maybe a little bit more about the Hubler, including the piece that for me is really about this difference between the two different knowledges that you outline, where he asks Bernd Becker to make a bunch of different faces. He gives him one word and then he can't organize them. He can't remember which face he was making. So pretend you're a priest, just to bring up the religion, pretend you're a priest, pretend you're happy, pretend you're whatever. And then he shows them to him and he can't organize. He can't remember, or maybe he can, but whatever.
Oh, that's good. Yeah.
So just, I don't know,
I
thinking
think
about.
I think within the context of my argument, I think I would say that it demonstrates those are facial expressions, right? That are gestures, right? They're gestures. They're facial gestures, and that inability to match back, one gesture with the prompt is sort of demonstrates is part of the proof that the gesture lies beyond semiotic signification and so forth, interpretation, that it is, one could say, all the more effective in its ability to touch and do something precisely because it exceeds that coding, that that kind of, right. And so you end up with something that could just fall under the category of the undecidable, but I was even wanting to go a little bit further, as you heard, and to think beyond just the undecidable even. Does that make sense? I don't, yeah.
I'm just trying to think this up. Yes.
That's just a quick attempt to,
I'm going to take advantage, John, of the fact that I have the microphone to ask a slightly devil's advocate question.
Oh, gosh.
I love the paper, and I was very struck by how you have a kind of no-holds-barred critique of the queer theory, the version of queer theory that thinks it is based on Foucault, but in fact repeats exactly the problems that Foucault was diagnosing and trying to get beyond. Mm-hmm. And you describe it as humanist neoliberal queer theory, and I think you're right. And then there is a strand of queer thinking in which the saved emerged, right? There is the damned queer theory, then there's the saved queer theory, and it's people like me and Jacques Calip, and of course I was happy to find myself in among the queer theorists who are not repeating
the pantheon,
not repeating the neoliberal humanist blunders. And I guess I wonder, and then you have a profanation without an object which itself is also characterized as queer. And so I guess I'm wondering about the division or the multiplication of queer, the category of queer, and the resonances of queer in the paper. Because on the one hand, queer theory is the problem, but on the other hand, what you were sort of unfolding and embracing is also designated as queer in some way. And I just think it would be helpful to have you sort of elaborate not the different queers, not the damned and the saved queers, but the what's at stake in wanting to hold on to queer at all.
Oh, right. Okay. I think it's because for me it still corresponds to I believe, I mean, when I say queer ethos, for instance, I am certain that still exists, and that it exists in the way according to the terms that I'm using, and it is the queer ethos associated with the authors that I list there, and I think the reason to retain it and continue to, in a way, assert it even, is because that persistence, even today, matters, and because I'm so convinced that it represents a different ethics, I'm also committed to fighting for that or speaking to that at least, you know, because so it's this kind of, you know, it's just or something, it's virtuous, it's ethical, it actually still happens. It doesn't happen as much as one might like, but who cares about frequency or measure in that regard? It just, you know, to the extent that it still happens, it happens. And that it is still attached to a significant extent to the kinds of bodies, actions, places, and things that have been ascribed with that nominative, you know, that have been, or that adjective, that have been given that, you know, and so I don't know. I mean, that's not.
No,
you know, it's
that's
just
very
sort of like I
helpful.
don't
It's
want
very
to give it
helpful
up
to me.
because then it would be giving up too much ground to those who, you know, on one side or the other of these multiple divides, is in no way seemingly interested or committed to that same ethical project, you know, or aesthetic project, you know.
Sure. I'm going to say thank you,
Thank you.
John, and we're going to forge ahead. Thank you.